So what forms
No problem,
has
Joe.
the Ukrainian propaganda effort come in, and how effective has it been?
Well, I think the key approach really has been to encourage the West to, through public diplomacy efforts, to support their war effort. But effectively, the West has, to some extent, been guilt-tripped into this. And the reason for that is that Ukraine's arguing that effectively it's in a situation where it looks like a David versus Goliath. You know, David obviously being Ukraine and Goliath being Russia, given the size of the two countries and the fact that Ukraine is so considerably outnumbered, both by troops and in weapons and materiel. But despite all this, Ukraine has managed to encourage the West to donate weapons in very considerable supply, to such an extent that Germany, a formerly pacifist country, has, in a historic moment, completely rearmed itself and sent tanks and other material to Ukraine. So that's been a big part of Ukraine's propaganda effort, effectively to shore up NATO and the West to provide material. But there's been other aspects to what they've done. One is a big element of what they've done is to raise domestic morale to support the war effort, which is obviously considerable given that there have been invaded and there's been such devastation in their country. So they've managed to, although the country was under conscription, they've managed to turn that into a positive and develop a sense of morale amongst their own population, because it could have been possible that when the Russians marched in, that your average Ukrainian didn't take up arms, but that's not what happened.
And so have the Ukrainian arguments mostly been truthful?
Well, I think that's the point. That's where they differ from the Russians in that sense. The Russians have lied to their own people, calling it a special military operation. The Ukrainians haven't lied. They've manipulated emotions and so on, especially in the West. But they haven't lied to their people. What they're saying is that we've been invaded, you need to fight for your homeland. And that's true. Their war is a war of necessity. The Russians are fighting a war of choice. And the Russian point of view has been that southern Ukraine and eastern Ukraine are effectively part of a larger Russia that they call Novorossiya, and that Ukraine never really existed. And this all smacks to some extent of the Nazi arguments in the 30s around Lebensraum and the expansion of the need for expansion in the German state.
Yeah, so tell us a bit more about the Russian propaganda effort within Russia and your assessment of the truthfulness or otherwise of that.
Well, so the Russians have been arguing that their operation in Ukraine was always around pacifying the Ukraine, but annexing the east and south, and that they're achieving their objectives. So that's what they're arguing, that they're achieving their objectives, and that their campaign is a campaign of denazification, as they say. So they say that the elites in the government in Ukraine is pursuing what they call a Nazi agenda, and by that they mean conducting genocide in the East, which is untrue. It's just not been happening. But the Russians have been arguing that it's been happening, and they've used those arguments against with their own people. So this denazification argument is the principal means by which they are justifying their aggression against Ukraine. And they always wanted to conduct that campaign of aggression. They dressed it up initially as an exercise on the border of Ukraine, but when it became abundantly clear that Russia intended to invade, and that intelligence was released by NATO powers, then they invaded anyway. And so Russian propaganda has almost always been used in support of deception. a deception operation, which is a military objective to outwit the enemy, if you like.
And there have been reports of dissent within Russia and reports of people in Putin's inner circle questioning the effectiveness of the campaign. Has there been much of an effort by the West and Ukraine to get messages through to the people of Russia? And has that worked? And what's been the extent of the dissent within Russia?
Well, there has been a fair amount of dissent in Russia, and we've seen that from the arrests that they've been conducting of their people in certain protests and so on. But the problem with that is essentially that whilst it is being exacerbated by Ukraine has something called its IT army, which is where users can sign up to provide their computing power to support the takedown of Russian websites and so on. So that's being something that's developed by the Ukrainian Ministry for Digital Transformation. And so there is that, but that's having probably a limited impact on Russian domestic opinion. My view is that the Russians largely know what's going on. They're not fooled by their government's propaganda. We're seeing that because large numbers of people large numbers of male Russians have been evading conscription by escaping into Finland, Georgia, Turkey and elsewhere. So I don't think Russians are really believe the propaganda that the government is putting out.
Okay,
but
is that because they have been able to get access to outside sources of information?
To some extent, I think they can get access to some information, but I think that at the same time, it's the Russian people are not necessarily stupid. They know what's happening. They can understand some of the messages that are coming from their own people, their own soldiers who are dying in great numbers. So they're not fooled that the Russian casualties are as low as the Russian state is saying they are when they can see on their own social media systems that more people are dying than the Russian government is admitting. But I think that's part of the reason. But at the same time, they are paralysed by these messages, and the protests are not as large as perhaps they ought to be, or indeed could be.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there, but really good to have a chat to you, Paul Baines, there in Leicester in the UK. Thank you.